I've just read the saddest book I think I have ever read, and I was going to do a single book review for it, but what I thought would be better would be to talk about a whole bunch of sad books that I enjoyed, and at the end of the review tell you which one is the saddest book that I have ever read. Say all of these books I'm going to discuss were either 4 or 5 star reads. These are books that will tear your heart out, shatter it into a million pieces, gather up those pieces and stick it in a blender, set it to liquefy, and just when you think they're going to pour the remnants of your heart into your still warm chest cavities, they take the blender and they'll throw it into the fires of Mount Doom. As we're talking about sad books, and as you're watching a channel with, well, me on it, we've got to start with Thomas Hardy, don't we? And I could have picked a few Thomas Hardy novels. I could have picked his entire back catalogue, but when we're talking about Hardy and depressing, there is really only one book that springs to mind, and that is Jude the Obscure. Saint Jude is the patron saint of lost causes, and Jude gets his name from that. This is the same root that Hanya Yangahara has named her character Jude St. Clair from in A Little Life. Jude is a young man who is determined to educate himself. He's self-taught, he can read Greek, he's quite intelligent, he spends a lot of time learning books, and he pursues that form of higher education. At the same time, Jude is a young man and he is not blind to the affection of women. He is drawn into 2 relationships with women, first with Arabella and then later with Sue. Jude and Sue are the star couple of this. It's like the Heathcliff and Cathy of Jude the Obscure, if you like. While Jude's educational life meets barrier after barrier and Jude's work life meets barrier after barrier, Jude's love for Sue remains strong, even though the way that they got together is not exactly approved by society, which then makes their life even harder. What makes their life even more difficult is the introduction of an orphan boy, Father Time. It's a really weird, distant boy that hasn't known any love, and his introduction to the family really shapes their world. And as Father Time and Sue begin to get along, the troubles in Jude's life come to a fore, and it all meets in this collision of just misery and horribleness that is done like nothing else. It is by far one of the most depressing novels you will ever read. And if you have read it and you just want to go back there, I just think the quote, "done because we are too many," really is the quote of the book. I remember Abbu by Humanyun Azad. In 1947, Pakistan was granted independence from India, and in 1971, Bangladesh was granted independence from Pakistan, meaning that if you were a certain person living in a certain place at a certain time, it was quite possible for you, without moving, to have lived in 3 separate countries. Abbu is the Bengali word for father, and I remember Abbu is the story of the relationship between one girl and her absent father, and her memories of him as he comes and goes. He's a professor and a community leader, and he's passionate about the Bengali culture and the Bengali language, but he's also a warrior and fighting in the war. And this novel is really, really poignant, and it's not just poignant, it's just one of these wonderful historical fictions that teaches you so much. But at its heart, it is an incredibly sad novel. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. I ought to have shot that dog myself, George. I shouldn't ought to have let no stranger shoot my dog. This 107-page novella gets its title from the Rabbie Burns poem To a Mouse. The best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry. So the reader that understands the reference knows that this is not going to end well. One thing that Steinbeck does that so many of these authors that I'm discussing do well is they foreshadow. They basically tell you what is going to happen, and it's that dread of what's going to happen that makes this novel so sad and so terrible. It's the empathizing and the understanding and the going, I can't believe this is about to happen, surely not. George is an intelligent and uneducated man, while Lenny is strong, hard-working and mentally disabled. George has a dream of one day settling down on his own land, while Lenny just wants to take care of the rabbits. The pair are on the run and looking for work after Lenny was accused of rape. He held on to a woman's dress and couldn't let go of it. In repeats of this, it's really clear that Lenny doesn't really understand what's happening or even what he is doing at the time or why the woman was scared of him. And the idea that he raped the woman is really quite ridiculous. But the idea that the woman was scared of Lenny is not at all ridiculous. You can really see where this situation comes from. We can really see George's emotions towards Lenny in the retelling of this event. They're very complex and contradictory emotions, but ultimately underpinning everything is this unwavering friendship that George feels for Lenny. This friendship is really put to the test when they get new employment and Lenny is the subject of bullying, and how this all plays out is just one of the most heartbreaking endings to a novel you could ever wish for. And if you're just in the mood for crying, you want to get to the crying quickly, this is the book for you. 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Hossain. Though there were moments of beauty, Miriam knew for the most part life had been unkind to her. Miriam is forced to marry Rashid, and Rashid is just flat out abusive towards her. There is a scene where Miriam cooks Rashid dinner and undercooks the rice, and what Rashid does next to Miriam is flat out unbelievably cruel and one of the saddest scenes I have ever read. Layla is pregnant and she believes the father of her child to be dead. She ends up taking shelter in Rashid's house, and Rashid starts to woo her as a second wife. This creates some tension between Layla and Miriam. It also creates tension between Miriam and Rashid. But as we've also already discussed, Rashid is a cruel bastard and Layla's in trouble as well as Miriam. This all takes place in the background in Afghanistan, which starts off with the Afghan-Soviet War but moves into the time of the Taliban gaining power. And it really examines the role of women and the violence that men treat women with in the country when there is no reprimand for them. The way this book ends is just so sad and completely beautiful. I could have picked any of Khaled Hossain's novels to put in this list, but I believe that 1,000 Splendid Suns is probably the best. An Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obioma. They were the minorities of this world, whose only recourse was to join the universal orchestra, in which all there was to do was cry and wail. Shinozo is a poultry farmer and is desolately poor. One day he sees a woman trying to commit suicide and saves her life. Him and Nadali eventually fall in love, but being an impoverished poultry farmer, Shinozo doesn't believe that he is good enough for Nadali, especially considering Nadali's parents are rich. This creates conflict and unhappiness, as Shinozo doesn't believe that he's good enough for Nadali. He believes he's from the wrong caste in life, and in order to impress her parents, he enrolls in a course in Cyprus. However, unbeknownst to him, obviously, he's been scammed and he lands himself in Cyprus with not enough money to live. One thing leads to another and he stays in Cyprus for much longer than he realizes. When he returns to Nigeria and to Nadali, he notices Nadali has a child. I must confess that the ending of this book really troubled me, and it took me a few days to really come to terms with why it happened the way it happened. Once you put it all together and you realize what is going on, it's just the most depressing picture. It's not exactly lollipops and fireworks to begin with. You have to empathize with Shinozo. You have to empathize with Nadali. The reason things happen in this book is just so unforgivable, and you will feel emotions reading this book. A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mystery is one of the finest books ever written. I strongly recommend it unreservedly. Ishva and Om are tailors living in India. Dina is a recently widowed woman, and Manek is a student. These poor people end up living together in the background of Indira Gandhi's emergency in India. Now, this is a fantastic historical fiction that will teach you a lot about India. But the aim of this book is to show you the miscarriages of justice, the exploitation of the common person, and just how senseless and meaningless it all is. There is a particularly interesting character in this called Beggar Master, who is sort of like a pimp to beggars, what is so interesting about Beggarmaster is he represents a hierarchy, he represents a form of authority for the common people, and even though he is blatantly exploiting the most needy people in society, he's kind about it, he's nice to these people, and he treats them better than the country that they live in. And I'm going to read you a quote from it just because I think this sums up the madness of the novel. "What sense did the world make? Where was God, the bloody fool? Did he have no notions of fair and unfair? Couldn't he read a simple balance sheet? He would have been sacked long ago if he were managing a corporation. The things he allowed to happen." This book has all the content warnings. This book is horrible and nasty, but Mystery's writing really just brings it back on these characters. It's one thing allowing horrible things and writing horrible things. It's another thing to allow you to connect to characters while they're happening, and Mystery just does that. Shuggie Bain by Douglas Stuart. She was no use at maths homework, and some days you could starve rather than get a hot meal from her. But Shuggie looked at her now and understood this was where she excelled. Every day, with the makeup on and her hair done, she climbed out of her grave and held her head high. She had disgraced herself with drink. She got up the next day, put on her best coat, and faced the world. When her belly was empty and her wains were hungry, she did her hair and let the world think otherwise. Shuggie Bain won the 2020 Booker Prize. It focuses on these two characters, Shuggie, a young queer kid in working class Glasgow, and his mother, Agnes, an alcoholic woman dealing with heartbreak and depression. And it's just such a wonderful character portrait. We know what's going to happen in this novel pretty early on. Not only does Stuart foreshadow it, but some of his characters will flat out tell other characters what's going on. But you have the whole of this book to get used to this idea, and he takes his time and he makes you invest in these characters. And even when it's happening, even though these characters are not the best characters, you just can't help but to feel sad for them when it all happens. And I think this is one of the most moving books that I have ever read. Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan. The thing we know is that humanity has a 100% mortality rate. We all die, but the facts don't matter. We can't bear to lose the people we love, and it doesn't quite register about the billions who die, or even about our own coming deaths. We don't experience our own deaths the way we experience the deaths of those we love. This book is broken up into two timelines. An earlier timeline in 1986, where Jimmy and Tully head to Manchester in order to celebrate graduating school. Jimmy is living with Tully and his parents. We get to see a real insight into the Scottish working class. We get to see the politics of these people in their everyday lives. Then we really go 30 years in the future to the later timeline, and Tully gives Jimmy a call to announce that he has a terminal illness and that he needs Jimmy's help. Jimmy is to assist Tully in euthanizing himself. Now, Tully's partner, Anna, doesn't quite accept what is going on here. Anna latches on to any positive sign as a proof that Tully is going to live through this illness, of which Tully is quite adamant that he is indeed not, and that he is suffering and that he would like to die with dignity. What is so masterful about this novel is the complete control of pacing that Andrew O'Hagan has. The party scenes are quite high-paced in the early part of the books, but once you know that Tully is dying, Andrew O'Hagan slows it down, and the closer to the event that it gets, the slower it gets. It's almost in real time when it happens, and it is just so drawn out, but at no point does it get boring. It just continues. It forever gets closer, even though it is going at an infinitesimally slow rate. This book is just so unbelievably sad, and this is the saddest book I have ever read.